Lecture Series. This is a spectacular opportunity to go deep on a remarkable cultural production. And I'll start with Ben Benus. We'll see if the okay, let's see how we're doing in the sound in the back. Can you hear me now? All right, so thumbs are up. Let's see how your mics are working. Ben Benus is a scholar who identified this atlas as worthy of serious scholarly work about 5 or 6 years ago. And the book that you've developed is spectacular. It's gorgeous, besides being deeply illuminated. I don't know if I've ever seen a work of a scholarship in art so beautifully illustrated. You must have spent an untold amount of time. So tell us a little bit, why did you decide to spend years of your life writing about Bayer's Atlas? How were you exposed to it? And for the audience, what is the Atlas? Why is it important?
Yeah, great. Well, the Atlas is something that was well known in the world of graphic design history. It would appear in all of the design survey books, but there was very little information about it. And I was curious to know more. I've written a lot about artists who collaborated with scientists to present information to general audiences. And so I was especially interested in Bayer's Atlas because he developed really original solutions to presenting information.
How do you even know about it? Did Carissa wake you up one morning and say, I saw something, you got to check this out?
Yeah, so I came to it in part because it would be reproduced in some of these design survey textbooks where there would be a reproduction, maybe just a little paragraph about it, and I wanted to know more. And you could still find it in libraries. It was a book that was commissioned by Walter Pepke as chair of Container Corporation of America and printed in 30,000 copies. And a lot of those were given to friends and associates, but also to universities, to research libraries. And so it wasn't that hard to get a hold of one. And once I saw it, I was just so impressed. And it's really a design masterpiece, and it's stunningly beautiful. And one of the things that really distinguishes it from its counterparts of the same time is the original concept that Bayer developed for the book. And I've prepared a few slides because as an art historian, I always find it easier to have a visual accompaniment.
Thank you. And you couldn't buy this book, right? It was just made and given out by Walter Pepke.
Right. Originally, it was a gift from Container Corporation. So Container Corporation, the Chicago packaging company that Pepke founded in the 20s, in 1936 had published an atlas as a Christmas gift for the company's friends. And it was very popular. It was a beautifully designed atlas, but it was fairly traditional and conventional in its concept. And for the company's 25th anniversary, Pepke asked Bayer if he would update the atlas. And initially, Pepke was, I think, just assuming that the information would be updated. But Bayer had an entirely different vision, this really ambitious educational concept. You can see here the atlas in the slide. It's binding and then a close-up of the title page. And the title page tells you a little bit about how ambitious Bayer's vision was for this atlas. One of the ideas was that he would take a much broader view of geography than conventional atlases took. So in addition to just maps with place names, he would inform audiences about geology, astronomy, meteorology, and you can see that little diagram on the title page where we see these overlapping circles that represent all different fields of knowledge with a little symbol of a human being at the center, because the essential idea of the atlas was that it was going to be a way for readers to think about themselves in relation to the world. The other thing that makes the atlas really original is that Bayer was going to communicate this information through really imaginative and innovative graphic approaches. And so in coming up with this weird hyphenated title, Geo-Graphic, the idea was to emphasize the graphic nature of the publication. And we can see in the page spreads, of which I'm showing a couple designs, here just how stunningly beautiful these page layouts are. The book begins with this view of what's then the observable universe and our place in the Milky Way galaxy. And then from this very expansive vantage point, he narrows down to an ever more granular view going to the solar system. And each page layout is different than the one before it, these dynamic, exciting page layouts. From the solar system, it descends down to Earth, where we look at the atmosphere, the space around the planet. Finally, we descend to Earth itself. We look at the surface of the Earth, its elevations, its depths, and Bayer is not content to just show elevation and depth on a map the way most atlases at the time do. Instead, he shows it in cross-sections, in pie charts, in area diagrams, all of these different ways so that people can understand the information in many different dimensions. And he finally gets to this kind of granular view of the world where he'll take a state map, and the maps, these large full-page maps were provided by Rand McNally, the Chicago publisher that Walter Pepke had a close relationship with, and he would supplement these maps with all kinds of granular data that you wouldn't be able to glean from these full-page maps themselves. And part of the idea was to teach readers how to read maps, how to ask questions about the content of the maps, and show things that a lot of these maps didn't illuminate. And so it was this really kind of ambitious educational project that Bayer took on that I was interested in.
So I really like the way that you helped us to see that you started big and moved in. It's like Monday Night Football, you're at the blimp level, and then you're at the city, and then you're at the field,
exactly.
And then you're with the player. And this is clearly meant for both the eye and the mind. Mm-hmm. And say a word about data visualization, about the presentation of information in a way that it could be seen as well as processed.
Yeah, I think that's a really important part of this book was that, a lot of the, Bayer himself, we should mention, is not a scientist. He reaches out to experts in various fields, astronomers, geographers, economists. They steer him to the latest research that's being done, to specialized journals and textbooks, and Bayer finds that a lot of this material is really dense and hard to navigate, and he brings a lot of his experience as an illustrator, as a painter, as an art director who created advertisements, and he takes those skills and uses them to present this information in really engaging ways to the public. And so we see a map of Illinois in which he's color-coded it to show us the distribution of different kinds of industries across the state. And then he's taken that information about the different industries and he's presented it in countable pictograms so that we can understand it in quantitative terms. And there's all kinds of little details like that that help us get a richer understanding of landscape, geography, how states and cities evolved to become what they did.
One thing I loved in reading your book was envisioning Bayer as trying to make this information accessible. And so much of modern communication has followed that lead, I think, which is a good lead into Andrew's work, because Andrew leads our educational programming in the Bayer Center. And when Lynda and Stewart Resnick gave us the support we needed to then create the center, a critical part of their vision was that we would recruit a colleague to lead public education so that we could engage students of all ages, citizens of all backgrounds, visitors and newcomers, as well as longtime Aspenites, in experiencing Bayer's his work, his way of thinking, his design principles. And so who better than Andrew to recruit as the inaugural holder of this role? An outstanding journalist who knows Aspen and the Aspen Institute inside and out. So say a little bit about the exhibition that you've curated, which is right downstairs in this building, and which is a complement to the exhibition that Bernard curated.
Sure. So the sort of impetus of the exhibition downstairs was to have a platform on which to build that educational programming, right? So sort of same source material as the other show, different conversation. And the way that it's organized is basically in sort of those different scopes that Ben was talking about. So we start with the observable universe, we go to planet Earth, we go to states and territories from there in that more granular view. And I've also devoted a section to Bayer's final chapter, which is devoted to conservation of resources and sustainability, environmental concerns. I hope we'll talk more about sort of all those as we go along. I'm not going to share a ton of slides with the show because all of you must go downstairs to the Resnick Gallery and here in the Dorhoesier Center afterwards. But I'll start just by highlighting one of the highlights of the show, which is Herbert Bayer's outside-in globe. This sort of Death Star-looking exterior shows you what he made in 1943. So remember, the Atlas is published 1953. This is a decade earlier. So this radically ambitious effort to understand our physical world and our civilization, it doesn't start with the Atlas, right? The Atlas is a culmination, right, Ben, of sort of all this work that Bayer has done, of combining, practical information about geography and such with his artist hand, his creative hand. So the outside-in globe is essentially a globe that takes the exterior of the Earth and puts it on the interior of a walk-in globe. And the idea was that you could see more at once, and that you wouldn't necessarily have the separation of when you're looking at a globe, and you can't see everything at once, that you would understand sort of the relation of land masses and their sizes, that kind of thing. And it is, I think, informed a bit from some of his ideas about international cooperation, right? The globe was made as part of an exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art that was titled Airways to Peace, an exhibition of geography for the future. So I think this is probably a theme we'll talk about a lot tonight, but that idea of using art, using this kind of data visualization as a force of progress, right? The Airways to Peace looked at things like the advent of air travel and the way that it was changing people's understanding of geography, right? And maybe informing a more global view. In the preface to the Atlas, Bayer asked the reader to consider the world as one. It's a phrase that I love and that I always think about when I go inside the globe, right? It's one of the results of going in there and sort of being surrounded by the Earth's exterior. Here you can see some of the interior of the globe, and I'll share just one photo of our replica downstairs. The original was, I think, 14 feet in diameter. This is 8, and I would be remiss if I didn't thank my friend and colleague, Bernard Jazzar, for being the champion and steward of making this replica happen. Downstairs, we also have a time lapse of the creative process from a sort of ingenious group out of Minnesota called Atomic Props, who were able to see the specs of Bayer's original and make their own. So do join me after our conversation downstairs to go inside. And I would just note that it's the replica is part of a room devoted to the planet Earth. And one of the particular things I think that's been connecting with people that I've been bringing through the exhibition so far is Bayer's interest in map projections, which is just this question of how do you take a spherical globe and represent it accurately in 2 dimensions. Here on this slide you're looking at, you can see an early draft page that Ben found in his incredible research for his book. I would point to the headline at the top, "Maps Can Lie," right? And on the other side is the page in the Atlas that's devoted to map projections. So just this idea of what happens when you flatten a globe, right? It distorts in some kind of ways, and some more than others, some in different ways. Bayer's ideal, which he illustrates here on this page, is the Earth's surface peeled like the skin of an orange. So what that means is that it has tears in it, right? But it doesn't distort land masses. So downstairs, we've animated that. We have it on the wall sort of showing that happen. And then also we have various examples of map projections in an interactive kiosk where you can see the ways that they distort. We developed that with my new colleagues from the Leventhal Center at the Boston Public Library. But I could go on, I get excited about this stuff, but maybe I'll stop there.
So the first thing to say is that in recreating this globe, it's immersive. You go in it. I've never walked inside of a globe before. Maybe others here have. But what do you think is the importance of the affective experience of stepping into the globe?
Sure. I mean, I think it's that consider the world as one aspect, right? That idea of things aren't as far away as you might think between different land areas, and and much of Bayer's work was informed by sort of these internationalist ideas. The United Nations pops up throughout the Atlas. There's and just think about his time of when he makes the globe. It's 43. The text for that exhibition was written by Wendell Willkie, who's a bit of a footnote in history right now, folks. But he was the Republican nominee for president in 1940. By 43, he's working with Roosevelt as interventionist policy, essentially, right? That idea of international cooperation, I think, is what he intended you to feel when you go inside.
One more question for you. You've designed the exhibition downstairs to attract the general learner, school children. And so have you had the experience of seeing younger people come into the exhibition? And what are you learning from seeing them engage with these ideas?
Sure, yeah. It's a great question. And I think it's interesting that the Atlas has something that anyone is going to get fascinated about and is going to feel personally connected to. As an educational tool, that is, that's like, a superpower. I guess one example during the Aspen Ideas Festival, I spent some time with the Bezos scholars, and there was a few scholars who were from Niger, so they obviously were very interested. Hey, what do you say about Africa? So we went and took a look through the internet, the digital atlas, and looked at the opening page of his Africa section. Right. What was fascinating to me that I had not noticed before was that the lead image of the Africa section is a purely physiographic map, meaning there's no political boundaries, right? The political map is on the next page and is very small. Now, why does that matter? Well, we're still in 53 when we publish at the height of, not the height, but sort of the beginning of the decline of colonialism, right? So Bayer, it would seem, in that choice is saying what's important is this physical map information, and that's the land itself, not what the French and English and everybody else is doing with their borders here. Now, to those students, that was very powerful, and started a really interesting conversation. And of course, because they're young people, they took out their phones and took pictures and started posting and texting their parents back home and telling them about what Herbert Bayer did with Africa. I think that's the sort of thing that's going to continue to happen with this exhibition.
You just gave me the thought that every single one of us in a personal way can connect to this atlas because we're all from somewhere and we've all been to other places. And so it is deeply individualized too, the experience. Bernard.
I think yes.
So do you want to show, look, can I ask you, I'll ask you a question.
Sure.
And so Bernard did the first exhibition in the Bayer Center, which we opened last year, which was basically a survey of the work of Bayer as a fine artist. It was spectacular. By the way, he designed the exhibition before the building was built. So think about that. The walls are of a certain size. He had already designed it, then we built the building, and then we put the work on the walls. So for this second exhibition, you're the one that led us into this idea of the Atlas and Bayer as a designer. So why did you choose this second exhibition for the Bayer Center? And it's now at the beginning of our second year. Share a little of the context.
Well, my approach to the Atlas came from an art point of view, and it goes back to 2008 when I was working on an exhibition I presented here on the anthology paintings that Herbert Bayer created in the last decade of his life. And I started seeing connections between those paintings and the atlas, which at that point I purchased a copy and it became my Bible, and it's still my Bible. It sits by my desk, and every day when I need to take a break, I just open another page of the atlas and look at it. It's endlessly fascinating, but the art, and I realized that Herbert Bayer was looking at this and using motifs from the atlas, which are illustrative, that became part of fine art. So I came to it from a fine art point of view. And because Herbert never distinguished himself between a designer and an artist, I did not see a distinction. And in fact, in the inaugural exhibition, there was a copy of the atlas on display as part of the presentation of Herbert Bayer because he considered it his masterpiece. But then what happened in 2008, Walter Isaacson introduced me to Ben, who was working on his book. And it's like, oh, the idea of creating an atlas. It's like, well, we need that because most people don't even know Herbert Bayer created an atlas. Very few people know that. And the exhibition was supposed to be in 2020, right, when the Bauhaus exhibition came down, but COVID interfered. And then Ben shared with Lisa and me a draft of his book, which was so fascinating, but we had to look at the text by itself and then the images in a different document. So here comes the challenge, is how do you create an exhibition based on a book that you make it visually fascinating? Well, Herbert Bayer, the ultimate visual communicator in whatever medium he chose to do, is always the inspiration for what we do, what I do, how I think of, how do I honor Herbert Bayer, because he set the bar very high, and we never want to disappoint. And I have a picture of him in my office, so he's always looking at me. So here's this beautiful book that most people don't have the chance to touch it. So we decided on the picture you see next to the cover and the book is the actual atlas, which you can actually touch. We have an old version of this book that's falling apart that you can leaf through, so you can touch the paper and you can leaf through and see the gold edges. So then we realized that, well, I didn't realize, I knew you can never tell a story of a book without contextualizing it. And Herbert gives us plenty of material to work with. And reading Ben's book, seeing how he had told his story of the atlas, starting with the Bauhaus, contextualizing, where Herbert started and how every part of Herbert's career leading up to 1953 had informed the atlas, gave us the kind of the plan to which to base our presentation. And so we started to talk about presenting this as a narrative. What led to the creation of the atlas, and then how the atlas was created, and then what was the effect of the atlas. So to contextualize that, we started first, we put up this curved wall in this gallery, which, if you remember last year, it was one big open space. So we wanted to lead you to the atlas and showing it in its full packaging as Herbert designed it. There was the book, which was extremely beautiful. There was the slipcase, which was exquisite. And very few people knew that he even designed the shipping package so that the atlas wouldn't get damaged in the shipping. I mean, this is a man who thought about every single detail. So we had to show it, and then we had to use Ben's text to start contextualizing this amazing book. And Ben provided us with tremendous material to work with, as well as, of course, Herbert, who, when you look at a gallery like this, on one side you see the work he did at the Bauhaus and in Berlin, juxtaposing an invitation to the opening of the Bauhaus building in Dessau with the page from the atlas beneath it, or an advertisement for the Dorland advertising company with a page from the atlas that kind of relates to it. And then, of course, we had to talk about him as a visual artist because he considered himself first and foremost a painter. And thanks to many lenders, but especially the Denver Art Museum that held paintings that had never been on display before, some of which were illustrated in previous publications in black and white, we were able to show for the first time some incredible paintings that Herbert Bayer did prior to the atlas. And we were all just so amazed. How was he already thinking about that? He couldn't have been thinking about the atlas in 1939 when he did the wind paintings you see on one side, or the weather patterns that he did in 1940s, because these predate the atlas by more than a dozen of years. But we tried to show in each case how these paintings have corresponded in the atlas, a correspondent page or idea in the atlas, which was, I mean, so taken by it. And then to see the paintings, which were so breathtakingly beautiful, and to be able to show them, they need to be seen. And unfortunately, and sadly, had not been seen before, but now here was the occasion to reveal them to the world in all their beauty, and to talk about them in the context of what Herbert was creating as an artist, but also as a designer. Again, he did not see that distinction. He worked. So in the back wall, for instance, the eclipses, you look at the painting from 1939, which is below the page from the atlas, and why was he painting this painting in 1939? What makes the weather? And then you look at the atlas page above it, and you see this one-to-one correspondence, which is just so amazing. But then we go into a gallery that actually walks you through, at least the best we could in the limited space, because Ben's book is extremely informative, and you gain a lot of information. And unfortunately, we could not show you all the parts that went into the creation of the atlas, but it's such an amazing endeavor that took 5 years, countless of people. But he worked with primarily 4 assistants in his studio here in Aspen, and most importantly is his wife, was hardly ever credited, but Joella was a big part of this production team. So we tried to show, you know, from sketches to photographs to things, how they went. And, you know, I could go on, but we're limited on time. But again, the resources that Herbert relied on, and how he took information that already existed and how he synthesized it to be able to better communicate it with the reader. He was such an amazing visual communicator. I will keep saying that because that's how he thought of himself as. And then we move on to, you know, politically, what was it happening, like what, you know, and then resources that were available, how much, this big diagram you see in the middle is such an impactful one, because the United States ends up being the most consumer of resources, right, versus others. And so these things, you know, to make them so visible, so easy to read, is quite ingenious. And then we finally, in the last gallery, we say, you know, while he was creating the atlas, Herbert Bayer was living in Aspen. He was designing the campus of the Aspen Institute. He was being the corporate designer for Container Corporation of America. He was painting. He was doing promotional material for the town of Aspen. This man operated on a level that is rarely seen by any other artist. To be able to do all of this simultaneously, gather all this information, digest it, and then give it back to us is just on another level. So we hope that this one last gallery will help place it in the context of Aspen, because Aspen was the source of inspiration for Herbert. He gained a lot of power, you know, inspiration, because he was in the environment that he loved so much.
That is a spectacular summary of an exhibition that you really have to see. It's like being inside the book, and in a sense inside the mind that made the book. Bernard, is there anything that you think he was leading us toward in some way that we should bear in mind? Is there anything that in the atlas that points to the way he was trying to influence us? I don't know, a larger message of the atlas?
Well, I think Ben touches on it quite a bit, and why don't I let Ben start with this, if you don't mind?
Well, yeah, I mean, one of the things that is so incredible about Bayer's concept for the atlas, I think we often don't think of atlases as telling a story, but in the case of the World Geographic Atlas, it culminates in a section about resource conservation. Bayer, in the course of doing research for the atlas, came to see not atomic warfare, which of course was in the media constantly as he was working on it, but really looming ecological crises as the biggest threat facing humanity. And in large part, the atlas finishes with this call to action and the details that we're showing here on the screen are from those final pages where Bayer uses charts and diagrams to suggest the dwindling resources, the depletion of natural resources as a consequence of overpopulation, and makes the claim that the only way to respond is a collective international action. And of course, there wasn't really any kind of precedent at the time. The UN is just taking shape, but he's really kind of anticipating a challenge that we're still trying to figure out, which is, how do you get all of these states around the world to agree upon a policy? And he saw education as a central tool in that process. And I think the Atlas is a kind of model that's still relevant in that
And
way.
I think we're looking at the projections of population here in this page, and he really looked pretty far out. I think I see the year 3000.
Right.
442 billion people on the planet. That is the long view. Is there any reference to atomic warfare in the book? I just saw Oppenheimer, so it makes me think of another kind of genius of that era.
It's really strange in that respect. He only talks about atomic technology in terms of energy, as a potential energy source. And in general, he's really interested in, already in the 50s, what are some alternatives to coal, to petroleum, to burning fossil fuels? And, it's not that he is prophetic so much as that the people he's consulting are leading him to the most recent scholarship, and he sees the importance of that. And I think his real contribution is to convey that to general audiences who otherwise wouldn't have known about that.
Let's go Andrew and then Bernard with the same question. Are there particular impacts of the work on the world, a relevance today, or a way that it influenced today's world that you'd want to comment on?
Yeah, I guess one as a side note, I saw Oppenheimer as well over the weekend, and so immediately what I did when I left the theater was go to the Atlas. In the New Mexico page, he does have a short paragraph on Los Alamos and the development of the bomb there and the Oppenheimer project. Very short, but it's there. Interestingly, Japan, no mention. In the Japan section, there's no Hiroshima.
So I am fascinated. This has become a touchstone for you, and now you go to a cultural moment or you read the newspaper and you pick up the Atlas to see what did Bayer anticipate this.
Yes, me and my book from 1953, Interpreting the World.
So any impacts today that are striking to you?
Yeah, I mean, the conservation piece, I think, is really powerful. He talks about the warming of the North Atlantic Ocean, and he has makes specific policy proposals, right? He has a 10-point plan on world hunger in this final chapter. Like, that is, that's not what atlases do. So I think that's interesting. The conservation chapter, I think one of the ways I think about it is that it's Bayer essentially arguing that this knowledge is not enough, right? I've just spent 338 pages, right? Thousands of small maps, hundreds of world maps, tens of thousands of data points from the hog farms in Wisconsin to the depths of the ocean, and all this information. But I think what he's saying in this last chapter is that knowledge is not enough. It has to be applied, right? That we have to use it to be good stewards, right? I think that's powerful, and that's Ben is a historian of this kind of thing, so he can correct me, but we're a decade before Silent Spring. We're ways off from the time that scientists are making this sort of activist step, right? Whereas today we sort of take it for granted, right? Elizabeth Colbert was here on campus on Friday. We have, I've seen E.O. Wilson on this stage make that same argument. So I think that's a great takeaway. I mean, one other thing I think about a bit in that is the aesthetics matter, beauty matters. I think the section on sort of the cosmos, right, and some of the incredible work that he did, sort of interpreting, the sort of unseeable, unknowable, right, and sort of the way that he communicated that. I think it is really interesting. And then also just thinking about, one of the connections I've made is with the Webb Space Telescope, right? And we think about last summer when those press releases were coming out and those new images were coming out and what that did to people, right? How, and sort of, it started these conversations and new fascination, and, those works are, enhanced in some of the same ways that Bayer was, right? Like he's taking these raw telescopic images and taking his artist's hand so that he can communicate them clearly to people in the atlas, right? Same kind of way today, raw scientists are taking this raw data, laying hundreds of images on each other from their telescopes, from different telescopes, in order to make something that, will communicate clearly to people, even though it's not, it is enhanced and it is an artistic work in some ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe speaking of art, Bernard, are there impacts that you see in the world or in Bayer's art?
Well, first of all, why I thought this exhibition was important and made an impact is to make us realize how small the world is and how insignificant the Earth is, especially when you see Herbert's view of the universe, where you can't even see the Earth in the Milky Way. You can't even see our solar system in the Milky Way. And so putting it in perspective is something we always need to do, is put things in perspective, because what appears huge is really tiny in perspective. So I think this exhibition, especially with everything going on, helps us put things in perspective. But as I said, Herbert was a visual communicator and drew on sources that he created throughout his life. So I found it interesting that we complemented the atlas, showing, because it's a Bayer center, so we have to always keep Herbert Bayer somewhere in focus in this. So in some cases, he actually used pages from the atlas in some of his paintings that you see on one side, and inspiration for other paintings in the others. And then in here, again, the atlas in all its various forms will show up. And I will do one example here. This is a piece called Thesaurus, Iconograph of a Day. Sorry, I have too many things in my mind. So you're seeing it in three versions. You're seeing it as an acrylic on paper, lent to us, and then the Denver from Marshall, Steve Marshall. Then the Denver Art Museum's version, which is the 80 by 80 large canvas, and then a lithograph that he created where the images flip. So if you look at this, how is it related to the atlas? Well, look at this chart that he so beautifully synthesizes three different charts that he looked at to create one on the evolution of life. And he takes it and turns it upside down, and if you look at the bottom part of the painting, you see that that evolution of life has become a motif in his painting. And then on the right, my right at least, you see the mountains and valleys, and then you see how he's abstracted those and they become a side motif in his painting. Or again here, one of the most profound paintings that I have found of Herbert's, which is called Geometry of an Illusionist, which I think is the most autobiographical painting of his, which he may never admit, but I think the title leads us to look at this, because geometry was a subject that was dear to his heart ever since he was a school kid, and would become a very important part of his output in life, geometry. And so in this amazing painting, which the Greenbergs, thank you, Jen and Ronnie, for giving this painting to the Institute, is such a phenomenal work. And we reproduce a drawing that I can't show you the drawing here in detail, but please go look at it, because the drawing is so fascinating. It leads you into the mind of how Herbert's thinking and how he changes things along the way. So here it is in its form, but one of the iconic spreads in the atlas, the very first spread that we kept talking about, is this observable universe and this dumbbell shape. Well, he takes this dumbbell shape, turns it on its side, and where does he place it? In a crucial part of the painting where all the dots, again, this painting is 80 by 80, so it's really large and you don't see the details here. But I think he's leading everyone to the center of that universe, which is his universe, in which he's creating these wonderful geometric shapes, the possible and the impossible, as he wanted to imagine them. And so he's the illusionist who's creating this amazing world for us to, you can get lost in this painting, you really can. And since 2009, when I first put it on display, I keep coming back to this painting, and I never get tired of looking at it. There's so much in it to see. So he really uses his work in an amazing way.
That is brilliant, and thank you for preparing that for us. I think you all know this, but Bernard is a volunteer for the Aspen Institute. He's been doing this for years and years and years because he loves the Institute, he loves Bayer, and he's able to make the time because Lynda and Stewart support that. And Bernard, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Quite a gift to us. So let's open it up for questions. I'm looking for mic runners. So I think we have a mic and we have a runner, and the mic is running to you, sir. So one moment. And we have a second mic runner back that way. So here we go.
It's on. I'm a lapsed geographer, teacher. I just want to thank you guys because, I'm an African, what is it? I'm an amateur Africanist, just for the hell of it, because I was in the Peace Corps. I just want to thank you. You guys all put me back in graduate school. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Maybe we can all get a credit for having read the book and gone into the 2 exhibitions.
And in fact, Bayer described the process of designing the atlas as going back to school. He said it was a kind of adult education that, kind of learning more about these things that he was already interested in, and, just loved the excuse. I think this is why he took the commission in the first place. He was already curious about these things, and he could just examine them in such depth.
So with empathy for our mic runner, we'll start back and work our way up. So it's 1 and then 2.
Thank you. I was just curious if this was a very early example of the use of pictograms, which Andrew mentioned earlier in your comments, because it's something that's always fascinated me in public health work, this deep exploration of data and using these creative ways. But this feels like a very early example. Is that correct, or was he inventing this?
Yeah, it's a great question, and the answer is no, he didn't invent it, but he was close with the designers who did invent this beginning in the 1920s in Vienna, and he was following the latest developments, this technique of using countable pictograms, this very kind of reduced geometric figures, as a way to make information accessible to general audiences, and it had a lot of applications in healthcare. In particular, a lot of campaigns for I think American Tuberculosis Association used them beginning in the 40s and 50s. Bayer saw the potential of this method along with several other designers in his generation and played a really important role, I think, in circulating this way of presenting information, and it became, I think, really popular as a result of the atlas.
And if I'm right, didn't the atlas's production take a little longer than originally planned?
In fact, the atlas was originally planned to come out in 1951, which would have been the 25th anniversary of Container Corporation of America, but it went over budget and past its deadlines as the project grew and grew in complexity. But Walter Pepke was committed to this project and was spared no expense, and ultimately they finished it 2 years later, and it was first presented to the public here in Aspen at the International Design Conference in the summer of '53.
I'm imagining Walter saying to Herbert, I gave you an unlimited budget and you exceeded it. Right up here now, the mic is coming to you.
Well, this may be a bit tangential and maybe not exactly relevant, but I think one of the great disciplines that Herbert mastered was landscape. And I think we often forget that. I don't, because I think this is one of the great places in the world, and it's the landscape, and especially the space between here and the tent, that is so magical and so wonderful. And I've enjoyed that since I was a teenager. I wonder if any one of you could talk about the relationship of the Atlas way back in the 40s to eventually his influence on landscape design, and specifically the intervention of what he did that I think really was the carpet that tied all these buildings together.
That's a beautiful question, not at all tangential. Bernard, maybe a thought or two?
So it's fascinating. Herbert grew up in a rural village in Austria, and one of his fondest memories was going through the countryside and being so in love with the countryside. But and his early sketches all have to do with settings of cities or towns within nature. But then he said, I don't want to paint landscape because I don't have anything original to provide to this medium. I mean, it's been done so amazingly well. So he avoided doing landscape paintings. But that changed in 1944 when he takes a trip to Vermont and sees the earth really moving. He says, the earth has not, he's realizing the earth was never like this and it has evolved over time. So he starts creating this Mountain and Convolution series, which we featured in 2018 and talked about how that became, and he states it, that became the reason grass mound, the very first piece he does in 1955, came out of that body of work. And so he stopped seeing a distinction between a two-dimensional and three-dimensional. To him, they became synonymous. And eventually, it would inform everything he would do. Again, when you have someone who does not distinguish between anything he does and sees them all interconnected, the Atlas falls right into place with everything he had done. And again, when we saw these paintings created in 39 and 40 and 41, they look like the Atlas. How could he have even seen them? Then so the Mountains and Convolution paintings, some of them look like the grass mound, but grass mound is 55. So it's he does not differentiate. I mean, it's amazing that his mind was constantly looking for these things and seeking them and then implementing them so beautifully and so seamlessly. That's what the other thing about this campus is. You cannot distinguish the environment from the man-made, the natural environment from the man-made. And again, he was amazing. And how the buildings all fit together with the landscape is amazing.
And I think I'll just add, Bernard, I think it's important to remember that the same year he completes the Atlas is the year that he completes the Sgraffito mural on the seminar building. And the idea of the Sgraffito mural was that it was a way of connecting the local landscape to the architecture, and the painting would kind of serve as a bridge between the two. And that's very much like, I think, his thinking with the Atlas, that all of these different disciplines, meteorology, geology, that they could all be connected with a kind of unifying language, unifying aesthetic.
I think I would add a small just note on that, that I think you just might find of interest, that throughout the United States portions, graphic displays, Bayer does a ton of illustrations of indigenous peoples' artwork. One of them, in the state of Ohio, is of the work of the mound builders, indigenous mound builders, which had been discovered during the time that he was creating the Atlas, I believe. And so he has an illustration of it that when I saw, there's no way not to connect that work to grass mound and to, it's sort of a long, I think it's supposed to be a serpent with a head, right? So it's sort of a circle mound with a long tail. You see that, and it's just amazing to be to go inside of his head a little bit and think about like how may have he been thinking about that as he was creating this campus and those works.
Thank you, Andrew. Another question, straight ahead.
You mentioned astrology and astronomy, and I was wondering, did he go to Stonehenge? Did he study the 5,000 years of Indian astrology and Mayan? And I also thought it was lovely that you had the man reminiscent of Leonardo da Vinci, and clearly he studied him as well. But I was wondering if he connected so many dots, and was he on drugs at any point?
There's a couple different questions there.
Bernard, do you want to take a shot at that?
I mean, Herbert left a lot of diaries that we still haven't had access to, and hopefully someday we will, but we might find out. I don't know that he went to Stonehenge, and I don't know that he was fascinated so much by astrology as by astronomy. And one of the more fascinating things I found was in one of his diary pages, he had clipped a picture from a television series that had Lorne Greene with another actor, thinking, why does he have this there? But then I looked at what was behind them, and there was an astronomical chart that was part of the series. Then I look at one of his drawings, and that chart ends up in his drawings. And then it ends up in a painting. It's like connecting the dots. So yes, it's possible, but we cannot say for certain. But his mind worked in so many different ways.
Another question over here.
Straight ahead.
Oh, straight ahead, yes, thank you.
Hi, thank you very much. So, you know, one of the many things that science and art share is continuity of message. You know, yesterday informs today, today informs tomorrow. Doesn't matter if you're working on a dissertation in physics or if you're in rock and roll. That's a fact. And clearly, you all have a firm grasp of where his head was as he created this work. Did any of you identify anything specific that was brought about as a result of this very innovative work?
It's a great question. There's certainly a sort of loose connection between the atlas and the recycling symbol, right? I think you've done a little bit of research into that, the competition for the recycling symbol that happened here at Aspen.
Sure, yeah. I mean, it was so 19 years after the Atlas debuted at the International Design Conference at Aspen here, the Container Corporation sponsored a contest among high school and college students to come up with a symbol to promote recycling, sort of coming out of that same spirit of the Conservation of Resources chapter of the Atlas. The winner was a student from the University of Southern California, and we have a small display on it downstairs in the Resnick Gallery, but that symbol, that one in that is the triangle recycling symbol that we all recognize today. So
that idea of the power of visual communication, that abstract forms can communicate ideas and sometimes more effectively than something descriptive or verbal. I think the Atlas makes an important contribution in that respect.
And to me, and I think that's stated clearly in your book, Ben, his training at the Bauhaus cannot be ever overemphasized, that really set the stage for him to just go beyond. I mean, this is a country boy who, up till the age of 18, had not been outside of Linz, which is a small provincial. Forgive me if I'm offending anyone by saying provincial about Linz, but he had not seen much of the world. The Bauhaus opened up his mind in such a way. I mean, we look at the work he does during that period, and how is he absorbing and how is he creating so much in such a short time that it's just baffling that he could absorb so quickly and then communicate it so effectively.
You know, I think my answer to your question is that the Atlas and Bayer's other works of art early in his career created the Aspen Institute in a very meaningful way. That many of the methodologies that we use, fact-based inquiry, the circular room with no sage on the stage at the head where dialogue is the name of the game, the effort to distill to its essence, whatever it may be, an idea, also the effort to connect and to bring people together and to connect ideas. No distinction between science and humanities and public policy in the Aspen Institute. And I actually believe that this atlas is not done creating, that those students that Andrew has invited into this community and into that globe are going to interpret the meanings of this atlas because it's available to all. And somebody's going to do something unfathomable with it, and Herbert Bayer will have been a part of that continuing story. So I think we've reached the end of our time here, but I'd like to ask each of our panelists, maybe we'll start with Bernard and work our way down to Ben, if there's one thought you'd like to leave the audience with as they perhaps go downstairs to see the exhibition and later go across campus to the Resnick Bayer Center.
Be curious and just put things in perspective. I think Herbert would have been happy about that. And then be meticulous, because that's the other thing he cared a lot about.
I guess I would say come to the exhibitions, one. Two, I think just to build on what Dan was saying, there's a note in Bayer's preface to the Atlas where the way he puts it is all knowledge overlaps, right? That all these different pieces that he synthesizes, they all inform one another. And I think that, in an age of specialization, and, I think that's something that I try to carry with me.
Yeah, I think, one of the things that Bayer communicates in the Atlas, and one of the things that I think we've tried to do with both the Resnick Center as well as the exhibition down here, is impress upon viewers the way in which designers and artists play an important role in shaping knowledge. And that was something that Bayer wanted to encourage people to think about and become more critical readers through that idea.
Well, thank you. Well, this has been a fabulous discussion. Each of you labored for hours and years to make this possible for us to enjoy. So thank you, and thanks to all of you in the SOF and Aspen Community Program.